Hello, we're just starting the journey together. I'm excited. Are you as well? In this lesson, we'll talk about settings in both render engines, Corona and V-Ray. I show you what settings I use in Corona and where you can find the adequate settings in V-Ray. So let's begin. Okay, so here I have the Corona renderer set up as a render engine. You can see that I have the Corona 7 version. I start from the basics here, but I just want to show you what I change. As we do still image, we of course leave it as it is here. We can of course choose different areas to render the image. Most of the time, I use views unless I want to test something. Then, I typically use region. And here, this is one of the first and basic settings I change. Typically, for testing, I use 2K or 2500 pixels longer site. For high-res, most of the time I set the longer site to 5000 pixels. If I use the images only for the social media platforms and on the website, 3K is typically enough. Here, from time to time, I turn off displacement if I want to test lighting, for instance, but the scene is heavy and I want to make it render quicker. I uncheck this option. In this section, we have different options, so we can, for instance, render hidden geometry, which can be handy if you want to have cleaner viewport and still render hidden objects. And here, I don't really change anything else. Now for V-Ray, we obviously need to have a render engine set up to V-Ray. I have V-Ray 5 here. So the common tab looks the same, and it basically looks the same for all render engines. So all the things I've shown you regarding Corona, I do exactly the same in V-Ray. However, other tabs are named differently, and they are particular to specific render engines. But I show you that they're pretty similar, just the naming or placement of a particular option is different. So let's start from the Scene tab in Corona. In the general settings, we have options that help us during a production process, for example, show VFX, which basically means the frame buffer. We have the same options in V-Ray, however, it's in the V-Ray tab. We need to go to the frame buffer section and click Show Last FBX. Pretty intuitive, isn't it? Okay, let's go back to the Corona renderer. And the next option I use all the time is Start Interactive, which is pretty self-explanatory. And in V-Ray, we have the option for interactive rendering as well. We can find it again in the V-Ray tab. However, this time it's in the IPR options. You need to click Start IPR. Let's go back to Corona. Setup Light Mix option is pretty handy, but I talk about it in another lesson in more detail. However, the idea here is to automatically set up the light mix from the existing lightings you have in your scene. In V-Ray, we need to set up light mix manually, but it will automatically add the layer lights anyway. And this I show you later as well, so don't worry if you don't know how to do it. Here, we have progressive rendering limits. So use these settings if you want your render to finish until it reaches a specific number of passes, or until it reaches a specific time, or until it reaches a specific noise level limit. If the values are set to 0, the render will be rendering until you manually stop it. However, if you have a limited time to render, or you render animation, or you have a couple of renders to render overnight, this may be pretty useful. Most of the time, I use a noise level limit. For high-res, I typically use 3%. In really demanding renders, sometimes 2%. In V-Ray, we have a slightly different story. Let me explain. If we go to the Image Sampler section, we can choose between two types. By default, it's progressive and it's good for testing purposes. The progressive sample renders the entire image progressively in passes, similarly as it is in Corona. So you can see the preview quickly, but on the other hand, more data needs to be kept in memory. And here, we can set limits similarly as in Corona. So we can set the render time. So here, you can choose after what time the image will stop rendering. So if we type 5, it should stop after 5 minutes. If we type 60, after 1 hour, and so on. We also have a noise threshold. So it's like the noise level limit in Corona. So to sum up, I don't really use Progressive Image Sampler too often for visualizations because, as I said, I use it only during the production process, not for rendering. But we also have another image sampler called Bucket, which, as the name says, renders images in buckets, so the rectangular regions. And this is what we use for rendering. We use Bucket Image Sampler for previews and for finals. And I also most of the time change some settings in this panel. For previews, I leave this value as it is, but for the finals, I like to set max subdivision to 12. For noise threshold, for previews I set something between 0.07 to 0.05 if the scene is more demanding, and for finals, it's something between 0.007 to 0.005. Let's talk about these options now. Let me show you how it works, as it can save you lots of time. Let's change the size of the image, so it will render quicker. Okay, let's click Render and wait a bit. Okay, so let's stop the render now. And now I will save it as CXR. So this is a file that consists of all information, light mix, post, so you can edit it after you save it. But it has one more great feature. We can use it to restart rendering from the point when it was stopped. So in our case, it is supposed to be the 15th path. It can be handy if you cannot render your image any longer for some reason, but you have already been rendering the image, let's say, for 2 hours and you don't want to waste this time. Before this, I show you the resume the last render option. It of course needs to parse the scene first, compute geometry and GI, but after this, you can see that it starts rendering from the last pass from the point it was stopped, in our case, 15th pass. Okay, now let me show you the resume from the file option. This time, we'll choose the previously saved CXR file. You can see that after preparing, it starts rendering from the 15th path. Cool, right? Can be really handy. In V-Ray, in the frame buffer panel, we have the resumable rendering option. It gives the ability to have incomplete renders resume where they left off from the previous session. We need to check it. We can set autosave intervals as well, which is highly recommended when rendering with Progressive Image Sampler. We can set it to 10 minutes, for instance. Here, we can save the destination of the saved location of the image to be able to resume the render. Let's name it Test V-Ray, for instance. You can see that it's saved in the special format. Click Render. Let's wait for a moment. We can stop it now. So if we click Render again, you can see that it's rendering not from the first pass, but from the time we've sent it last time. Another cool thing is that if we close the file and open it again, it will automatically render the image from the last saved pass unless we turn off this option. Rendering hidden lights can be handy from time to time if you want to have a clean preview but at the same time render the lights. In V-Ray, we have this option here. You need to uncheck hidden lights if you don't want to render them. Next option, render only masks. It will be helpful, for example, if you forgot to add a mask on the specific object, you need to change it in post-production. If you check this option, the engine doesn't have to calculate everything, which makes the render way faster. You can see that we don't have any render masks added, and we'll discuss render elements later on, but let me show you quickly what it is about. Let's add wire color, for instance, and let's start interactive rendering. So you can see that we don't have the beauty pass rendered anymore, but the mask is rendered. In V-Ray, we have this option here. Okay, now let's talk about the material override. That is pretty useful, especially when working on lighting. Let's turn on this option and let's choose some material. I typically override everything to standard gray, but this time, as everything is in this material, I need to choose something else. Let's say this one. And here we go. Everything is overridden with the skin material. We can also choose what objects we want to exclude from being overwritten. We can click the plus here and add it from the viewport, or we can choose from the list. Here we can also change exclude to include, and then everything we select will be included to be overridden. Additionally, we can preserve some things from being overridden. We can preserve displacement, light, and glass materials or unsupported materials. In V-Ray, we can find this option in global switches. We just need to check this option. Here, we can, for example, include or exclude from the list. It works the same as in Corona. We can change the settings and choose what objects should be included or excluded. We also have the exclude layers option, so we can choose layers. So if we want to exclude glass material, for example, we can have one layer called glass with all glass objects we want and select this option. Plus, we have exclude object ID, so we can exclude all objects that have a specific ID. So it's not the same as in Corona, but we can easily figure out what to do to create the same effect. I add some material to show you that it works similarly. Here we go. We have this object in its original material rendered. Okay, now let's go to the denoising. So I always use Corona High Quality as it gives the best results. Only removing fireflies can be useful in scenes where fireflies are the only issue. It's much faster than full denoising. NVIDIA GPU All Denoiser Fast Preview is to provide fast, noise-free previews. It is applied almost in real time during interactive or regular rendering, and after the rendering is stopped. You can use it for testing. Intel CPU IE Speed Quality Hybrid, it is a combination of the features of the Corona High Quality Denoiser and the NVIDIA GPU IE Denoiser. It runs purely on the CPU and uses machine learning to produce noise-free results. However, it's much slower than the NVIDIA GPU IE Denoiser, so it cannot be applied in real time during interactive rendering. And the last one, Gather Data for Later option, can be used to skip the actual denoising process, but save the denoising data within the CXR file. So you will be able to denoise it later using the Corona image editor. As I said, I typically use Corona High Quality, and there are two parameters controlling this denoising type. Amount, this blends between the denoised and non-denoised image. The default value of 0.65 provides a good balance between denoising and fine detail. So basically, the lower the value, the less processed the image is, has more details, but the render to achieve the clean results is longer. With denoising, you need to know that this is a great tool, but if you render not long enough, you may lose details, so always be careful with that. The denoise radius is a radius of the blurring filter. By increasing the value, you may help reduce very strong noise. Decreasing the value instead can help prevent loss of fine details. But again, the default value usually works best. In V-Ray, to have a denoising option, we need to add a render element, V-Ray Denoiser. Now let's talk about the render selected mode. Thanks to this, we can render specific objects in the scene that still will be included by light, for instance. It's handy if you want to re-render the object or a couple without rendering everything from scratch. So here, you can choose what objects to include in the render. Again, we can choose from the list or select the objects manually. Here we go. Only the object I've chosen is rendered. Simple. We can also select from the viewport. And finally, we can choose by object ID. We can set it by going to Object Properties. Great. In V-Ray, we have more different options and we can set it in the image sampler. So we can render all objects that have specific texture. Selected works as viewport selection in Corona. Include exclude list, also the same as in Corona. We can choose layers that we want to render. Or we can choose by object ID, and we do it exactly the same as we did it in Corona. Here we go. If we change image sampler to bucket, we'll have the same options. Okay, let's talk about the scene environment panel. We can decide if you want to have the environmental light taken from the environmental tab. So if you click 8, it will take the map you have there. Or you can choose the single map and set it here. Or use multiple maps, which I think I have never used. But it's there if you want to experiment a bit. Plus, we have the override section, so we can override direct visibility, so what we see on the render as a sky, reflections and refractions. This panel is for volumetrics effect, if you want to use it from here. In V-Ray, you can find it here. We can basically override GI. It allows you to override the 3ds Max environment settings for indirect illumination calculations. In V-Ray, we can override reflections and refractions together, or we can override refractions separately. Additionally, we can control the appearance of matte objects in refractions as well. And here, I don't really change anything except for displacement, but really rarely. So if I want to change the screen size value, the lower the value, the better quality displacement, but at the same time, more memory is used, and it will cause longer preprocessing time. In V-Ray, we can go to Settings and choose Default Displacement, and we can change edge length. The higher the value, the better the quality of the displacement. But we need to be careful with changing these displacement options, as it can drastically longer the time of rendering the image. And for the V-Ray, we need to change one more thing. We need to set global illumination. If I render with progressive sampler, I leave it as it is. But if we choose bucket, I change it to irradiance map. And I change the settings of it to high res. I set this to medium and I change this value to 70 and this one to 35. Light cache I leave as it is. And at the end, one more thing we need to additionally know about in V-Ray: color mapping. So let me turn off the render mask and change a couple of things to make it easy for you to see what we are talking about. I turn off all the layers. Now I increase the intensity of all the lights. Even more. Actually, let's increase the intensity of some of the lights more. I want to see some overexposed parts, so we need to increase this light. Okay, it can be something like this. Okay, so let's go back to the render setup and go to the color mapping panel. So basically, we have Reinhardt set up as default, and this is what I use, and I only adjust it by changing burn value. But let me explain why. So to make it easy for you to understand, I show you two other examples first. I choose linear multiply here. Let's render and see how it looks. You can see that it's super bright. We can of course adjust it later on with an exposure layer, but in general, you can notice that it causes bright parts of the image to appear burned out. Let's save this version. right-click, choose Edit Node, and I name it Linear so we know what is what. Now let's change the type to exponential. It looks like the problem disappears, but it tends to wash out the colors and desaturate. So it's a lack of contrast. Let's save this version as well. Let's rename it. And let's compare both options, so we can tell the difference straight away. Look at these parts. So, as I said, linear multiplying burns out the bright parts of the image, exponential fixes this problem but makes the image look washed out and lacks contrast. And Reinhardt, which I use, is basically a blend between these two. The value 1 is like linear multiply. Let me show you. While the value 0 is exponential. You can see it here. So the values in between will blend these two effects. I typically start with 0.5, but this is just a starting point. We can adjust it depending on the results. Okay, with that being said, we've discussed everything that we needed in this lesson. At the end, I like to remind you that I've done the videos on YouTube where I explain the settings for Corona Renderer and Viewer in detail, so if you haven't watched it yet, I put the links to it under this lesson. See you in the next one.